Hello, this is Wes from PCgamer, and I'm here today to talk about one of my favorite games of all time, Resident Evil 4, or rather the new remake of Resident Evil 4 coming from Capcom in early 2023. You know, Resident Evil 4 to me doesn't feel 16 years old, but maybe that's because I played it on the GameCube, and then again on the Wii, and then again on PC, and over the years I've seen it ported to pretty much every console under the sun and VR. It feels like Resident Evil 4 has kind of just always been around, but we're now just a few months away from Capcom's remake arriving, and that's continuing in the trend that they started a few years ago with the Resident Evil 2 remake and the Resident Evil 3 remake. Until now, we've only gotten a brief look at this RE4 remake, but last week Capcom let me play through the opening few minutes through the first encounter in the village. That wasn't nearly enough to really dig into the minutia of what's changed in this game and what stayed the same, but after that short demo, I was able to speak with Capcom producer Yoshiaki Hirabayashi, who answered several of my top questions about the remake. So let's get into it. Here are 5 big questions about the RE4 remake answered. Number 1, are QuickTime events still in? Alright, the answer to this one is yes and also no. So Capcom says that button prompts during cutscenes are out. So this suggests to me that one of my favorite scenes in the game, which is the knife fight with Krauser towards the end, where it's this long cutscene, but you get interrupted with button prompts that you have to press at the right time to attack and block with the knives. That doesn't sound like it's going to be a QuickTime event anymore. Capcom didn't say that specifically, but that's a big cutscene QTE that comes to mind for me in RE4. Now, Capcom did say that there are still some QuickTime events within gameplay. For example, when an enemy grabs you, you're going to have to tap a button to break free from it. And I also saw that when the chainsaw enemy attacks you in the village, you can mash a button to block the chainsaw with your gun, mash that button too slowly, and, well, Leon's going to have a bad time. So it doesn't sound like QTEs are completely gone from the game. They said specifically ones that happen sort of in-engine gameplay are still going to be there. So that might mean we're also going to be doing QuickTime events to dodge boulders. Number 2, does Resident Evil 4 feel more like a horror game? So from my time playing it, definitely. Now, a lot of this just comes down to presentation, right? With more advanced graphics, the lighting just by itself makes the game feel a lot spookier. Enemies are definitely more intimidating because they're so much more detailed, and you can now crouch, which I think actually encourages you to sneak around. And even though this isn't suddenly like an advanced Splinter Cell kind of stealth game, I think it kind of just implies this extra level of danger that enemies pose to you and naturally makes you kind of want to skulk around and avoid them, and it makes situations more tense. Now, when I got to the village, it definitely felt more like a horror game because I watched the villagers actually light up the cop who's kind of mounted on a pyre in the middle of the village. It was definitely a graphic death for him compared to in the original game. So they are not pulling back on the nasty in this game at all. Now, Capcom played coy and didn't want to tell me about anything really new here about kind of the balance between horror and action, but they basically said they want players to discover for themselves new things enemies are capable of, and that, you know, this being a horror game, it would kind of lose some of its impact if they went too deep on the mechanics. Now, all that said, RE4 is still definitely an action game, and the extra mobility that you get as Leon, just with kind of a newer control scheme, kind of balances out some of the new horror elements, I think. But we'll talk about gameplay a bit more later. Number 3. Okay, Resident Evil 4 is more of a horror game this time, but will it still be goofy? The answer to this, I'm relieved to say, is a pretty definitive yes. So, the demo that I played took me through the village fight. It had the Ganados attacking me right up until the moment that the bell rings, and then they retreat. And right before the title drop, Leon just dropped the exact same line that he does in the original game.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And then we see the RE4 logo appear on the screen. So yes, this game is still goofy. Capcom confirmed to me that Leon is a character with a lot of history street. They wanted to keep that, and so he's still making his silly one-liners and jokes throughout the game, just like he did in the original game. And a big focus for them this time around actually was kind of enhancing some of the interplay between characters. They didn't go into any detail, but I assume that's going to mean more dialogue between characters like Leon and Ashley, maybe Salazar, maybe Ada. We'll see. They didn't give me any specifics like that, so I'm just speculating on what that actually means. But I think it's safe to say that with Leon's dialogue staying the same, we're probably going to still see some of the goofy stuff from other actors. Now, will their voice acting be different? Quite possibly, but I think it's still going to have that element of silliness that was, to me, a very defining characteristic of Resident Evil 4. Number 4, how long is RE4? This is a question that I'm actually surprised Capcom answered for me, but I was asking them how they responded to the critical response and the fan response from the RE2 and RE3 remakes, specifically the fact that RE3 was not as well received as RE2, and they specifically mentioned that one of the things people criticized RE3 for was the length of the game, and they said in this case the playtime for the RE4 remake is going to be about the same as the original game. Of course, they didn't give me any specifics like changes that they're making to the castle or the island, nothing like that, but it sounds like the overall length of the game is going to be basically the same as RE4. So anyone who is expecting them to, cut out a major chunk of the game, seems like that is not happening. Okay, number 5, is gameplay changing in any significant ways in the RE4 remake? So there are some minor changes here that are going to be pretty obvious for a game coming out 16, 17 years after the original. They've, streamlined and modernized some control things, like same as in the RE2 remake, you can now move and shoot at the same time. You can reload while you're running, which is pretty nice. I had to do that when I had a whole bunch of Ganados on my ass in the village. But a lot of it is still the RE4 you remember. The inventory Tetris is the same, but they have added a new inventory tab that shows you combinations of items, like for making, advanced combined herbs and ammunition, stuff like that. They told me that you're still going to be escorting Ashley. They haven't drastically changed the escort system. It's basically the same. They did mention that one difference is you'll maybe feel a bit more interaction between the characters because they're adding in more dialogue and communication there. The most interesting changes that I saw in this demo were some dynamic things that they added to the environment. So, for example, the chainsaw-wielding Ganado in the village was able to actually chop down like some stairs by swinging the chainsaw around wildly. When I tried to climb the ladder up to the tower, they destroyed the floor out from under me while I was kind of perched up there thinking I was safe. And the most interesting was there's a cow in the barn and kind of an oil lantern hanging above it. And when that lantern gets hit or shot and falls down, it lights the hay on fire. The cow goes crazy and goes rampaging through the village and can actually like send the Ganados flying. So I asked about that scene, and Capcom didn't give me any specific examples of other things like that they've added to the game, but they did say that, like, yes, those dynamic elements are something that they're adding. So that is definitely going to be an interesting factor in the level design for these later areas. Seems like there could be a lot more little things that you can do in combat that you couldn't do in the original game other than just directly shooting at enemies. Now, the one other change that I mentioned earlier was you can crouch. So what does that mean? It means that there's kind of a light stealth system here. I asked them to go into detail about, will you be able to hide from enemies and kind of lose their aggro? Capcom didn't want to address that directly. Again, they were basically saying, this is a horror game. We want people to be able to discover how these things work themselves without spelling out the details of the systems. But they did say that they are not intending for this to be now a stealth game, right? They don't expect you to be sneaking around all of the time. So I don't think it's going to be especially powerful. I think it's going to be more of an option when you're low on ammo and you want to try to avoid some enemies, or an option to, sneak up on some enemies. I actually did that in the village. I snuck up on several of them by crouching and killed them with a knife instead of wasting ammunition on them. So there are some options that stealth is going to add into the mix, but I think it's going to overall be relatively minor. Hopefully there are no painful mandatory stealth sections later on in the game. We'll see. Don't know about that. And finally, a bonus question. Is Capcom going to bring back the chainsaw controller that they originally released for the GameCube in celebration of the RE4 remake? I had to ask, and the answer is no. They were very amused that I asked, but it's not happening. Sorry. So that's it. That's our first look at Resident Evil 4 Remake. It's not that far away. It's coming out early next year. The game looked great. Expect similar graphics to the Resident Evil 2 remake. RE Engine, it ran really well, but a lot of it was very familiar. It felt like Resident Evil 4 with a few modern touches, some interesting new things like the dynamic environmental stuff with the cow, the fact that you can crouch now, but we're really going to have to wait and see how much of a difference those things add up to make in the final game. So that's it for now, but keep an eye on PCgamer.com for more on the Resident Evil 4 remake as soon as we get to play more of it.